They touched the daughter of a veteran. And he made them pay. Stay with me, because this story isn't about spoiled rich kids winning, it's about a father who knew what war was, and showed them what real strength means. My name is Emily, and I never thought my life would change in one cruel night. I was walking home from the library when a group of wealthy boys, sons of businessmen and politicians, pulled up in their expensive cars. They laughed, they mocked, they thought the world belonged to them because of their father's money. Their voices grew sharper, their hands rougher, until fear turned my legs to stone. They weren't interested in me as a person, to them I was just something to break. But what they didn't know was this: my father wasn't just any man. He was a veteran, a soldier who had seen war and carried its shadows in his eyes. And when he found out what they had done to me, the rage that burned inside him was colder, sharper, deadlier than anything those rich boys could ever imagine. He didn't shout. He didn't go to the police, because he knew power and money would bury the truth. Instead, he waited. He studied them, one by one, their routines, their arrogance, their blind faith in privilege. And then, like a soldier planning his final mission, he began to strike. He started with the leader, the one who laughed the loudest, the one who thought nothing could touch him. That boy always left the nightclub late, stumbling to his shiny car, drunk on money and arrogance. My father was waiting in the shadows of the parking lot, silent as the war had taught him to be. When the boy opened the car door, a hand clamped down on his shoulder like steel. My father's voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that froze blood. Do you remember her? My daughter. The boy tried to laugh it off, but the smile died the moment he saw the fury in my father's eyes. There was no shouting, no chaos, just a veteran reminding a spoiled child what fear truly meant. The others thought they were safe behind their gated mansions and bodyguards. They had no idea that my father moved like a ghost, patient and relentless. He slipped past security, left warnings carved into their perfect lives: a shattered window, a ruined car, a blood-red message on a mirror: she is not yours to break. One by one, they began to feel hunted, their money useless against a man forged in war. By the time they realized they were not untouchable, it was too late. My father didn't need bullets or violence to break them, he needed only their own fear, the weight of guilt, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, a soldier was watching, waiting, ready to strike again if they ever dared. They tried to gather together, thinking there was safety in numbers, meeting in one of their father's empty mansions, music blasting to drown out the fear. But my father had been in darker places than this, and no walls or gates could keep him away. He cut the power first, silence swallowing the house, plunging them into blackness. Panic spread fast, their voices cracked, shouting names, fumbling with phones that found no signal. And then they heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps of a man who had survived battlefields, now walking straight toward them. The first boy bolted for the door, only to find it chained shut. Another tried to hide behind the sofa, but my father's voice filled the darkness, steady, merciless: you thought money would protect you. But war taught me how to find men like you, and make them remember. A lamp flared to life, and there he stood, my father, scars catching the light, his eyes cold as steel. One by one, he named them, forcing each spoiled heir to face what they had done. And when the night was over, when fear had broken them more completely than violence ever could, they understood the truth: you don't lay hands on the daughter of a veteran and walk away unchanged. They sat trembling in the half-light, stripped of their arrogance, their designer clothes clinging to them like paper armor that meant nothing here. My father stood tall, silent for a long moment, letting the weight of their fear fill the room. He didn't need to shout, his presence was enough. Then, with slow steps, he moved closer, his boots echoing against marble floors once polished to shine for men who had never fought a real battle. He leaned over the ringleader, the boy who once smirked at me as though I was nothing, and whispered so coldly it carved itself into their bones: war doesn't end on a battlefield. It follows men like me home. And tonight, it found you. None of them dared move. They couldn't meet his eyes. In that silence, their world collapsed. Money, power, names, all turned to dust in the face of a single man's wrath. My father didn't strike them down, he didn't need to. He left them with something worse, the knowledge that every shadow could be him, every sound in the night could be his return. And as he walked out into the darkness, leaving them broken in their own mansion, I knew justice had been delivered, not by the law, but by the hands of a soldier who refused to let his daughter's pain be forgotten. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the echo carried through the empty mansion like the toll of a bell. The boys didn't move, they sat frozen, pale faces drenched in sweat, the silence louder than any scream. My father's shadow stretched across the driveway as he walked away, steady, deliberate, like a soldier leaving the battlefield. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain, but for them inside the house it felt suffocating, as if his presence still lingered in every corner. The ringleader tried to speak, but his voice cracked, words tumbling out like broken glass. None of them answered. They all knew what he had left behind, not bruises, not wounds, but something far worse. He had stolen from them the illusion of safety, of invincibility. Now every sound of a car engine, every creak of a floorboard, every shadow crossing their path would remind them of him, of the veteran who had marked them. My father didn't look back once. He didn't need to. He had delivered a message stronger than any punishment. They would never forget his daughter's face, nor the rage of the man who came for them. And as he disappeared into the night, I understood their power was gone, and my father's war had followed them home. Days turned into weeks, but the terror never left them. The mansion that once echoed with music and laughter became a prison, every corner filled with whispers of my father's footsteps. They stopped going out at night, stopped flaunting their cars and money, stopped looking people in the eye. The arrogance that once fueled them had burned away, leaving only hollow shells. But for my father, life returned to its quiet rhythm. He rose with the sun, his hands steady as he worked in the yard, his gaze calm as if nothing had happened. Only sometimes, when the light hit his face just right, I could see it, the shadow of war, the soldier who never left the battlefield, the man who had carried his fury like a weapon and used it to protect me. The boys' fathers tried to cover it all, to erase the fear, but money couldn't buy back their son's sleep. Nightmares clawed at them, they woke screaming, hearing his voice, seeing his eyes in the dark. They understood now, power meant nothing when faced with a man who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. And though my father never spoke of that night, I knew. I knew they would never dare touch me again, nor forget the lesson he carved into their souls: you don't lay a hand on a veteran's daughter and expect to walk away whole. One of them eventually tried to leave the city, thinking distance would free him from the shadow my father cast. But fear doesn't fade with miles, it grows heavier, following like a ghost. He found himself checking mirrors, locking doors 3 times, jumping at every sound. The others mocked him at first, but they were no better. They lived with the same weight pressing on their chests, the same memory of a man whose presence burned into their bones. Their fathers met in private, whispering about how to silence the veteran, how to make the problem disappear. But deep down, they knew money couldn't buy courage for their sons, and no bodyguard could protect against the kind of man who had already walked past every defense. They tried lawyers, threats, even quiet offers of bribes, but my father didn't answer. His silence was worse than any reply, because it left them wondering, was he finished, or was he just waiting? And as weeks turned into months, their wealth became a curse. Every mansion felt like a trap, every car window like a target. They had tasted what true fear was, not the fear of losing status or money, but the fear of a man forged in war, who had nothing left to prove but everything left to defend. For me, life felt different too. I walked the streets no longer afraid, not because the world was safer, but because I knew one truth burned into the night: my father would always be there. And they, those spoiled heirs, would spend the rest of their lives remembering it. Months later, the city whispered about them, those once untouchable sons of wealth who now walked with lowered eyes and trembling hands. They stopped frequenting the places where they had once reigned like kings. The clubs were too loud, the streets too open, the shadows too long. Their friends drifted away, sensing weakness, and without their arrogance they were nothing but frightened boys in expensive clothes. One night, word spread that one of them had broken down completely. He was found in his father's garage, sitting inside a luxury car with the engine cold, muttering again and again about footsteps in the dark, about a scarred man waiting just beyond the headlights. No one dared laugh. Everyone knew the story by then. They had touched the daughter of a soldier, and the soldier had taught them fear that no amount of money could erase. Meanwhile, my father never spoke of it. He worked in silence, his hands calloused but steady, his eyes carrying both the weight of war and the peace of a man who had delivered justice with his own two hands. He never sought glory, never told anyone what he had done. But the city understood. Whenever those spoiled heirs walked past, pale and broken, people glanced toward my father's modest house at the edge of town with quiet respect. And I, his daughter, knew the truth most of all. He had given me more than safety. He had given me freedom, the knowledge that no matter how dark the world became, there was one man who would face it all for me and make even the powerful tremble. Seasons changed, but the mark he left on them never faded. They tried to rebuild their lives, to hide behind new parties, new cars, new empty laughter, but it always cracked, because every mirror still reflected his shadow. Some drank too much, some lashed out in anger, but none of them could escape what had been carved into their memories that night, the cold stare of a man who had walked through war and chosen them as his battlefield. Their fathers spent fortunes to cover the shame, sending their sons abroad, surrounding them with bodyguards, whispering in boardrooms about control and reputation. But it was useless. The veterans my father had served with still lived in the city, and word had spread quietly through them too. Everywhere those boys went, they felt the weight of unseen eyes, men who nodded with respect when my father's name was spoken. Money could buy silence, but not safety, not respect, and certainly not sleep. At home, life was simpler. My father sat on the porch at dusk, smoking in silence, the lines of his face lit by the last gold of the sun. Sometimes he would glance at me, and in his eyes I saw no regret, only the calm of a man who had done what was necessary. He never boasted, never told the story aloud, but the lesson remained etched into the city's bones: a soldier does not forget, and a father does not forgive. And I walked the streets free, knowing every shadow that once frightened me now carried their fear instead. Years slipped by, but the legend of that night only grew sharper. People still whispered it in cafes, in quiet corners of bars, in hushed tones at schools where new generations came and went. Don't touch her, she's the veteran's daughter. The spoiled heirs, once the untouchable rulers of the city's nightlife, became ghosts of themselves. Some vanished overseas, some hid behind their fathers' fortunes. And some stayed but never recovered, haunted by a fear that no therapy, no money, no power could buy away. For my father, nothing changed. He rose early, drank his black coffee, fixed what was broken around the house. His silence was his weapon, and it was enough. Every scar on his hands reminded me he had carried battles the world never saw, but the only fight he chose here was for me. Sometimes I would see one of them on the street, expensive suit, fine car, but the swagger was gone. Their eyes darted to every shadow, their steps quickened if they thought someone was following. And when they spotted me, they would look away instantly, pale, as if my very face was the trigger of their nightmares. Justice had no courtroom here, no jury, no verdict. It had my father's steady footsteps, his soldier's eyes, and the silence he left behind in a mansion filled with trembling boys. That silence never ended for them. And for me, it became a shield, stronger than walls, stronger than fear. time turned their shame into a curse they could not shake. Even when the city forgot, even when new scandals buried old ones, they still carried it in their bones. At night, the ringleader woke drenched in sweat, hearing the echo of boots on marble floors. Another could not stay in a room with the lights off, terrified of shadows moving at the edge of vision. A third never touched a steering wheel again, convinced that at any corner the veteran would appear. They had everything: money, power, names that opened doors, but they had lost the one thing they never thought they'd need: peace. My father carried none of it outwardly. He tilled the soil in our small yard, sharpened tools with the same patience he once gave to weapons, and sat quietly in the evenings with a calm that came only from knowing justice had been done. He never raised his voice, never spoke of that night, but the truth lingered in the silence between us. He had not just punished them, he had broken their illusion of control, left them prisoners of their own fear. And as I grew older, I understood more deeply: the war had never truly left him. It lived in his scars, in his discipline, in the shadows of his eyes. But the night those boys touched me, it was the war itself that came for them, wearing my father's face. And it would haunt them until their last breath. Years later their names still meant wealth, but never respect. At galas and charity dinners, people whispered about them behind polished smiles: those boys, the ones the veteran broke. They tried to drown it in excess: louder cars, brighter parties, new scandals. But the fear never left. It clung to them like a shadow stitched into their skin. The ringleader grew older but never stronger. His eyes twitched at sudden sounds, his shoulders jerked whenever boots clicked on tile. The arrogance that once filled his voice had turned brittle, fragile, like glass about to shatter. One of the others left the country, but distance could not free him. Rumors followed that he lived alone, curtains always drawn, checking locks 3-4 times each night. My father remained unchanged. He aged with quiet dignity, his hands rough, his back straight, his silence unshakable. To the neighbors he was simply the old soldier who tended his garden and greeted them with a nod. But the city never forgot. Wherever he walked, men moved aside, women lowered their voices, and even the rich heirs looked away. I knew why. That night had carved a truth too deep for time to erase: power without honor is nothing, money without respect is dust. And the children of privilege had learned it from the one man who needed neither. My father's war had ended long ago, but his justice never would. The city moved on, but their lives never did. They carried their wealth like armor, but inside they were fractured men, shadows of the arrogant boys who once thought the world bent to their will. No matter the suits they wore, no matter the cars they drove, their eyes always betrayed them, darting, restless, haunted. They could buy everything but sleep. Whispers of that night never fully died. Bartenders told the tale in half-truths, drivers repeated it as a warning. Students passed it down like folklore: don't cross the veteran's daughter. Her father is the war itself. To outsiders, it sounded like legend. To those boys, now men, it was a scar they carried deeper than flesh. My father never once gloated. He worked his land, polished his boots though he no longer needed them, and kept his medals in a box he rarely opened. When people greeted him, they saw a quiet old soldier. But those who remembered the night knew different. He was not just a man. He was a message. And as I watched him grow older, I understood the legacy he had left. He hadn't simply protected me, he had carved into the bones of this city the truth that even power and money must bow before honor and blood. Those spoiled heirs would carry their fear until the end of their days. My father, meanwhile, carried only silence, the silence of a man who had won his last battle without firing a single shot. Years blurred into decades, yet the weight of that night never loosened its grip. The heirs grew older, their faces lined not by hard work or battle but by sleepless nights and the slow poison of fear. They inherited fortunes, sat in polished offices, signed contracts with trembling hands, but respect never followed. Behind closed doors they argued with their fathers, ashamed, broken, always glancing over their shoulders. And still, the whispers lived. In bars, in alleyways, in classrooms filled with a new generation, the story carried on like smoke. Don't ever forget what happened when they touched the veteran's daughter. It became a warning, a legend that shaped the city more than their family's money ever could. My father aged quietly, the weight of his years bending his shoulders but never his spirit. His eyes, still sharp, carried storms I had long since learned to read. At dusk he would sit on the porch, the world around him calm, as if his presence alone kept the balance. Neighbors saw only an old soldier in worn boots, but I knew, the man beside me was a battlefield disguised in silence. Sometimes, walking through the city, I caught sight of one of them. Expensive suit, polished shoes, but the same darting eyes. They never met my gaze. They crossed the street, lowered their heads, their fear still alive as if my father's shadow stretched across time itself. And I realized then, his war had never truly ended. It lived on not in medals or parades, but in the unbreakable truth carved into those boys' souls: you can buy the world, but you cannot buy freedom from a veteran's justice. Even when their hair turned gray and the world began to forget their youthful sins, they never escaped it. At business meetings their voices faltered, at family gatherings their laughter rang hollow, and at night their dreams dragged them back to that mansion drowned in silence and fear. Their children grew curious: why does father always check the locks twice? Why does he jump at the sound of boots on tile? But the answers never came. Shame sealed their mouths, while fear kept their hearts chained. The legend, however, never aged. Taxi drivers told it as if it had happened yesterday, young men whispered it to each other as a warning, and in the city's veins the truth remained: arrogance had met its match in the quiet wrath of a veteran. My father's steps grew slower, his hands more fragile, but the respect around him only deepened. People greeted him with nods that carried weight, with silence that spoke louder than praise. He never raised his voice, never sought to remind anyone, he didn't have to. His silence was enough. And for me, grown and strong, I carried his shadow like armor. Wherever I went, I saw how the world bent around the memory of what he had done. Those once powerful heirs still lowered their eyes, still walked faster past me, as though my presence alone could summon him back into their lives. They had lived their whole lives rich, but never free. My father had lived his life scarred, but never broken. And in the end, that was his final victory. Time showed no mercy. The spoiled heirs grew into old men, their bodies wrapped in fine suits but their souls chained to that single night. They built companies, bought houses by the sea, surrounded themselves with servants and luxury, yet the fear never left. It lived in the corners of their mansions, whispered in every creak of wood at night, stared back from every shadow. Even when they smiled for cameras, their eyes betrayed them, hollow and restless. Some tried to drink the fear away, others buried themselves in work, but nothing worked. The story outlived them, crawling into the next generation. Their sons and daughters heard rumors at schools, stories told by classmates with wide eyes: your father? Wasn't he one of those kids the veteran broke? And so the shame passed down, heavier than gold, sharper than wealth. My father, meanwhile, aged with the calm dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. His hair turned white, his step slowed, but his gaze never lost its fire. He tended the garden, fixed fences, sat quietly on the porch with the evening sun at his back. People passing by greeted him softly, as if in the presence of something greater than just a man. He never answered their whispers, never spoke of the night that changed everything, but he didn't need to. The city remembered for him. And I, standing beside him, realized the truth: those rich heirs had lived long lives, but they had never escaped their punishment. My father had won a war without weapons, and his victory stretched across decades. They had power, but he had honor. They had money, but he had silence. And in the end, it was his silence that crushed them more than any blow ever could. Years rolled on, and the once arrogant heirs became frail men in expensive coats, clutching canes and hiding behind tinted car windows. Their power remained on paper, their wealth untouched, but their dignity had long since rotted. They could sign contracts worth millions, yet they could not steady their hands when a veteran passed by on the street. Their children avoided questions, their grandchildren inherited whispers, and their legacies carried the stench of cowardice. The city never let the tale die. It became folklore, passed in low voices. Don't cross a soldier's family. Don't test the patience of a man who's seen war. Taxi drivers, shopkeepers, even young students who hadn't been born when it happened knew the story. It was no longer about just one girl, or even one father, it was a warning carved into the bones of the city itself. My father, older now, walked with measured steps, his shoulders still square though time had bent his frame. He sat on the porch in the evenings, the light of sunset painting his face, calm as ever. To neighbors he was simply a quiet old man with sharp eyes and a steady silence. To the city, he was the shadow that had once humbled the mighty. And for me, every glance at those broken heirs reminded me of the truth: my father's justice had outlived their arrogance. Their wealth had built them walls, but it had also built their prison. His silence was his weapon, and it echoed longer than any shout or gunshot. They had lived long lives, but he had left them haunted, and that was his victory, eternal and absolute. Even as their hair turned silver and their bodies weakened, the mark of that night never faded. They walked with careful steps, eyes always scanning, shoulders jerking at sudden sounds. At banquets their voices trembled, at boardrooms their hands shook when signing deals, and at home they avoided mirrors after dark, afraid of seeing not themselves but the ghost of the man who had broken them. Their families tried to erase it, to bury the memory under layers of charity and power. Yet whenever their names were spoken, the story followed, quiet but unshakable: those are the ones the veteran humbled. And so their heirs inherited not only wealth, but shame, the unspoken curse of living in fear of shadows. My father lived simply. His days were filled with the earth, the garden, the steady rhythm of a life earned in silence. He never reminded anyone of what he had done, never raised his voice, never sought recognition. But wherever he went, men moved aside, women lowered their tones, and even those broken heirs lowered their heads. They could never meet his eyes. I often watched him at sunset. Sitting on the porch, the golden light softening the scars time could not erase. To the world, he was an old soldier. To me, he was the man who had given me back my life, who had written justice into the bones of men who thought themselves untouchable. And I understood then, their money had bought them years, but not freedom. His silence had bought me peace, and that was a currency no fortune could ever match. Decades later, their faces appeared in newspapers with titles like "Prominent Businessman Retires" or "Legacy Family Celebrates Anniversary," but behind those polished smiles were eyes that still darted, haunted by a night they never escaped. Their portraits hung in gilded halls, yet every time someone glanced at them, the whispers followed: "That's one of the boys who crossed the veteran's daughter." Wealth gave them status, but it could never wash away the quiet curse carved into their names. Some died in luxury, but none in peace. Their funerals were filled with flowers and cameras, yet the air was heavy with something unspoken. Those who knew the story exchanged looks, remembering how easily their power had crumbled under a single man's resolve. And though tombstones bore grand titles, the truth lingered in silence. Fear had been their lifelong companion. My father lived longer than many of them. Bent with years but never broken, he still walked with the steady step of a soldier. Children in the neighborhood ran past his gate, some daring to whisper the legend as if it were a ghost story, their eyes wide with awe. Adults nodded to him with quiet respect, never too loudly, as if afraid the weight of his silence might turn toward them. I sat with him in those late years, watching the sun slip below the horizon, and I realized something profound. He had fought no battle that night with fists or blades, but he had won a war that reshaped lives forever. They had carried wealth, he had carried honor. They had bought power, he had earned fear. And in the end, it was his silence, steady, immovable, unyielding, that outlasted them all. When my father's time finally came, the city grew still. There were no headlines, no speeches from officials, no ceremonies with medals, only a quiet funeral on a small hill, with a wooden cross and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Yet people came. Not just neighbors, not just friends, but strangers, men and women who had only heard the story, children who had grown up with the whispers, old soldiers who saluted silently as they passed his grave. The heirs, now gray and bent, sent flowers, but none dared to come in person. They had lived too long under his shadow, and even in death they feared to meet him. Their children, curious, asked why, and the answer was only silence, the same silence that had crushed their fathers all these years. As the seasons changed, the story of my father grew into something larger than memory. It was no longer just about a daughter, spoiled heirs, and a single night of reckoning. It became a parable whispered in classrooms, repeated in barracks, told by fathers to sons: don't mistake wealth for power. Don't mistake silence for weakness. A soldier's justice reaches further than you think. Even after the last of those heirs was gone, their families still carried it, an invisible scar stitched into their name. And my father, though the earth claimed him, remained unforgotten. His legend lived in every shadow, every careful glance, every whispered warning. I visit his grave often. I place my hand on the wood of the cross and feel not grief, but pride. Because I know, his war may have ended long ago, but his justice became eternal. In this city, there will always be one truth carved deeper than money, deeper than fear: a veteran never stops protecting his own. And so this is the end. Years passed, the world moved on, new generations rose who no longer knew the names or faces of those boys. Yet the legend endured, like a shadow that never fades. People still whispered, never lay a hand on the weak, for they may have a father who is a soldier. And if he comes, even the richest will fall. My father's grave stood quietly on the hill. Plain and unadorned, no gold, no statues, yet everyone who walked by removed their hat, bowed their head, and showed respect. Old veterans came in silence, pressing a hand to their chest. Children listened wide-eyed to the story and looked at the cross with a mixture of fear and awe. The ones who once dared to touch me had long since gone, leaving behind nothing but whispers of shame. Their families inherited houses, cars, and fortunes, but also the curse, the memory of how one soldier forced them to live in fear for the rest of their days. I stood at the cross, the wind pulling at my hair, and in my chest there was no sorrow, only light. My father had won. Not with money, not with crowds, but with his silence, his resolve, and his love for me. He had become a legend, an eternal warning that would outlive us all. And I knew, as long as this land stands, as long as the word veteran carries weight, the story of my father will never die.